We had a wonderful opportunity to have lunch with Lauren and James and Lauren's boss there today, and a young man who just moved into the area from North Jersey. And Lauren's got a very faithful, wonderful testimony there at her work, and so he came out and joined us this morning for church, and had an opportunity to just talk to him, and I spent a couple hours with him actually, and it was a wonderful opportunity. So just keep inviting, Joan, and thank you for your testimony, Joan. Thank you for your faithfulness. Even in a pool, you can share the gospel. I mean, really, just wherever we go, whatever we do. So I really do. I admire that testimony. I don't know about you, but in my experience, there are two phrases that I have found to be particularly difficult for people to utter. Two separate phrases that are hard to get out. One is two words, and the other is three simple words. The first phrase is, I'm sorry. I find it very difficult. People have a very difficult time saying that, even though we may have said something or done something that we regret. Somehow it's just hard to get those words out of our lips. But I think the second phrase is as hard, or perhaps even harder, than I'm sorry. And that's the phrase, I forgive you. I forgive you. I've titled this message, Being Big Enough to Forgive. And as your introduction says, I forgive you. There are few words that hold as much power to heal a human spirit as those three words. When they are freely expressed, they can mend a broken friendship and they could breathe life into a dying marriage. I forgive you. They can be the first rays of sunlight to a soul that's imprisoned in guilt, or they can be the first sign of rescue to a sinner lost in the sea of regret. I forgive you. I put in your notes there, forgiveness defined. I defined forgiveness this way: the act of forgiving, to cease to feel resentment against the offender, to pardon. Now, both the Greek and the Hebrew verbs for forgive can also be translated to send away. To send away. For the victim, for the one who was offended, it could mean to send away the hurt, to send away the anger, to send away the resentment, to send away the revenge, to send away the bitterness. Send it away. The question that we need to ask ourselves is, who is this forgiveness really for? Who is it for? We tend to hold on to the belief that our unforgiveness is somehow going to hurt the perpetrator. And if we don't forgive them, they're going to be hurting. But the opposite is actually true. I've said this before. Bitterness and unforgiveness is like drinking poison and waiting for the other person to die. That's what it does to us. Unforgiveness or forgiveness is more for me than the person that offended me. The perpetrator never considers us in the first place, and our unforgiveness has absolutely no effect on their behavior. However, our unforgiveness has a huge impact and an impression on our own lives. I'm going to read for a quick story out of this book, Beyond the Darkness, by Cynthia Cubiton and James Mallory. Beyond the Darkness, Healing for Victims of Sexual Abuse. But it talks about this topic of forgiveness, and I want to read it for you. For me and for every victim, to forgive is a decision we will have to make. I wasn't so overwhelmed with love, nor did I become so spiritual that I just found myself forgiving everyone. I decided to forgive. I prayed for restoration, and God truly caused the pain to be forgotten. It also was not a one-time event, even though I believe that the first time I forgave met all the scriptural requirements. Typically, the process is one that does require a long period of time. I was in touch with the obvious effects my abuse had had upon me, and I implemented the principle of forgiveness in every area I understood. I forgave the perpetrators. I forgave the co-perpetrators. I forgave the betrayer of my innocence. I forgave the thieves of my childhood. I forgave the shattering of my identity. I forgave everything I could think of. I began to feel better and less angry, but still empty. Then I started forgiving the perpetrator for each flashback that still tormented my heart and my mind. Every time a memory of abuse would burst across my mind, I would forgive the perpetrator. I would ask God to restore his love to me in place of the despair that had come from human sin. Every time I overreacted and became too angry, I would ask God to forgive me for that sin. I would ask him to replace with his love what had been taken from me. It took about 15 months for me to process all my forgiving. Even when I didn't want to forgive, I would do it anyway. I was determined to do everything I could to believe in God. If he could really restore me, I knew somehow that I could make it through life. This topic of forgiveness is one that it's difficult even for us as believers. So let me ask you a question. Is there someone in your life that you have never forgiven for an offense or for something that you feel that they did or said to you? It's my heart's desire to help each and every one of us today. I put in your notes there, on your notes there, a couple of lines. If there's anyone in your heart or that God brings to your mind during this message tonight, I would ask you to write the names down on those lines. And as we work through this message, this lesson this evening, you'll see why. But for God's sake and for your sake, I ask you to think about it. I find many people struggle with those three simple words because the heart doesn't really easily speak them. And if and when the heart does speak those three words, I forgive you, they're usually entangled with ulterior motives. You see, most of us opt for one of three different types of forgivenesses, which are really not true forgiveness. I want to take note of these three this evening because it may be possible that someone here is in the process of forgiveness that is not true forgiveness. And hopefully this will all make sense for you by the end of the message. But there's three different types of forgiveness rather than complete forgiveness. The first is what I call conditional forgiveness. Conditional forgiveness. I will forgive you if, or I will forgive you as soon as you, or I will forgive you if you come back and make things right. If there's a condition to my forgiveness, it's not true forgiveness. The problem is there's always a condition attached to the forgiveness. If you admit that you were wrong, if you say you were wrong, then I will forgive you. See, there's a condition there. If there's a condition attached to my forgiveness, then I have not forgiven and I have not sent away the hurt and the pain that the perpetrator has caused. That's conditional forgiveness. The second one is what I call partial forgiveness. This is when a person says, I will forgive you, but don't expect me to forget. I will forgive you, but I will never forget what you did. Or I'll forgive you, but just go away and leave me alone. We saw that last week with David and his son Absalom. I forgive him, but I don't even want to see him. Or I forgive you, but I'm watching you because I don't trust you and I know it'll happen again. I forgive you. There are a lot of people that we're willing to forgive just so we don't have to see them again. But that's only partial forgiveness. But probably the most common type of incomplete forgiveness is what I call delayed forgiveness. And this is probably the most common of all of these because it goes like this: I will forgive you, but I just need some space. You have to just give me some time. I will forgive you, but you need to just give me some time. I'm just not ready to completely forgive you yet. I just can't seem to get over it. And it's delayed forgiveness. And the guilty party waits and waits and waits and waits and waits and has no idea when the forgiveness is ever going to be issued. Because it's delayed. And again, I've said this often, and I probably have said it here. I think I may even put it in your notes. Most people would rather sit on the judgment seat than the mercy seat. It's so much easier to sit on the judgment seat and judge than it is on the mercy seat and grant mercy. We are quick to judge. We are slow to forgive because they hurt us and we want our pound of flesh. You hurt me, so I want to get you back. Part of the reason, I really believe this with all my heart because I've experienced it in my own heart. Part of the reason that people don't find God's perfect peace and freedom in their life is because they haven't completely dealt with the people in their lives that have hurt them. And they need to forgive them. Absolute, complete forgiveness. Not conditional, not partial, not delayed. Absolute, complete forgiveness. And I want to show you the alternative of what happens to a person who refuses to forgive. I'm going to use the illustration of a downward staircase because that's how it goes. There's 5 steps down, and it just gets progressively worse as we get down through this. The first stage is what I call the offense. There's the offense. An offense is something that upsets our moral or physical senses there. Someone does something that causes us to be offended. And it can be something small or it can be something significant. And we're offended. Somebody says something, somebody does something, and there's an offense. We get upset. But the next downward step is what I call the resentment stage. There's this feeling of indignant displeasure at something regarded as wrong. You hurt me, so I resent what you did or I resent what you've said. You've treated me unfairly, and all of a sudden bitterness starts to grow. And it just continues to grow. And then it goes down to the next step, which I call the hatred step. Because now hostility and animosity hits a point. And this is the point when you begin to look more at the individual than at what they did. You start looking at them versus what they did. And it's extremely personal at this time, and there's no joy in your heart. Even when you look at that person, you can't think anything good about that person at all. All you can think of is the negative. And the next step down then is what I call the grudge, which is this deep-seated anger, and you can't see that person without thinking about the offense. And I will tell you, I have seen people in good, independent, fundamental Baptist churches who would not walk down the same aisle as a person. They would not even look at that person. And these are good, strong, long-time believers. It's because there was an offense, and there's resentment, and there's hatred, and there's a grudge. And last is finally when revenge sets in. Because then I'm just waiting for the right time, and when I get my chance, I will get him back, I will get her back. And that's how it goes, even with believers, if you don't deal with it at the offense stage. There's a strong desire to repay, and you want your satisfaction. And at this point, you may feel that if you forgive, the perpetrator is forgiven, and you're no longer accountable to God for the sin, and you really want them punished. I just want to see them hurt because they hurt me. It's amazing how much that goes on, even amongst the family of Christians. And I must confess to you, again, I had to learn this lesson. There have been times in my past when I have conditionally forgiven, I have partially forgiven, or I have even delayed forgiveness. I've shared this testimony with you, I think, before, but I'll just briefly share it again. After years of talking through things with a very close friend of mine who's a pastor, you remember my dad walked out on us when I was in 5th grade. He walked out on my mother, my brother, and I. And I didn't realize how much that hurt, even in my mid-20s, because we didn't have a relationship, my dad and I. My dad left us, moved to Philadelphia, and ultimately moved down to Bridgeton, New Jersey with his second wife. But every time I would talk about the divorce and it came up, I would just get emotional. I'd just start crying. It's like, what is wrong with me? Grow up. And then through some counsel and talking and things like that, I realized I needed to forgive my father. And this is over years. And finally, my wife and I, we prayed about it, and I jumped on a plane and flew down to Florida. I said, Dad, you mind if I come down for the weekend? He said, no, come on down. Flew down to Florida, got to his house, got there the first day, trying to talk, trying to pray, and nothing. Just talked about the weather and all his doctor's appointments, which is typical. Called Char that night. He said, no, we never got to it, never talked. I said, pray tomorrow. In the morning, sitting out there, nothing happened, and just talking about weather. And it's just, how you're looking for the right time to say something, and it just never got there. But about 11:30, his wife decides she's going to go up. This is now his third wife. She's going to go upstairs and take a nap. And it looked, and God says, Rick, now's the time. So here my dad and I were sitting down in the Florida room there, and across from the table with each other, and I finally got up the courage to say, Dad, I guess you're wondering why I came down to talk to you. And he looked at me and says, yeah, I figured you were going to witness to me. I was like, well, I'd like to. I said, but that's not really the reason I came. Which it sounds like a terrible son, but that's not the reason I came. I said these words. I said, Dad, I came to talk to you about Mom. That's all I said. I came to talk to you about Mom. 8 words. And for the next two hours, he went nuclear. I mean, he went from 98.6 to nuclear. And he exploded. And I'm sitting there, and I'm hearing all this stuff. And he's giving me his side of the story, and all this thing, hitting and he had all of this anger and bitterness in his heart and in his side, and it just came out. And after 2 hours sitting there, I looked across the table from him, and I said, Dad, all I want you to know is I forgive you. I forgive you for what you did to Mom and Don and I. And I love you. Complete forgiveness. No delayed, no partial, nothing. Complete. Dad, I forgive you. It's done. I got back on that plane. I sat in my seat in the window, looked out the window, and it was like the weight of the world was off my shoulder. It was gone. And I just went, oh. You see, I've been carrying a weight that I didn't know I was carrying for 25, 30 years. Unforgiveness can do that to you. And it was and it was gone. I mean, literally, I could feel it. So I know what I'm talking about here. I know how freeing it is to be forgiveness. And being a forgiver. Forgiven people should be the best forgivers, right? And again, I haven't got this baby beat. I still need to continue to learn, but boy, what a valuable lesson that the weight of the world was off my shoulders and I never even knew I was carrying it. But from that point on, I had a relationship with my father that I hadn't had for 30 years. And now it was no longer, hey, how you doing? What doctor's appointments you have? It was just different. And I had the privilege of preaching my father's funeral down there in Florida. And I could do it with an absolute pure heart towards my dad. That wouldn't have never happened 15 years ago, 15 years before. Never. Because I would have done it with regret. But as we look at David's life this evening, we come to a scene that actually has three parts to it. It's a familiar story, but I think it gives us this perfect example of forgiveness that we need to see this evening. Because David himself, he faces a very hurtful situation in which he has to make a decision to forgive. And it's, in one sense, he passes the test with flying colors, but in another, he falls short of perfect forgiveness because he's only human, just like each and every one of us. And in David, we find an example of a man who struggled with forgiveness and one who we can encourage us. I pray that it will encourage us this evening as we look at 2 Samuel chapter 16. Because I think in 2 Samuel chapter 16, David is at the lowest point in his life. You can't get much lower than he is at this point. He had his sin with Bathsheba. He's lost 2 sons. His family is a complete mess, and Absalom has stolen the kingdom away from David. He's taken his wives, he's taken his concubines, he's taken everything. He's lost everything. David has lost everything. And I wonder if this is when David penned the words to Psalm chapter 40, verse 1 and 2, says this: I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined unto me and heard my cry. He brought me up also out of a horrible pit and out of the miry clay, and set my feet upon a rock and established my goings. And in verse 12 he says this: For innumerable evils have compassed me about. Mine iniquities have taken hold upon me, so that I am not able to look up. They are more than the hairs of mine head. Therefore my heart faileth me. David is in deep, deep despair. But I want to look at the example of forgiveness out of 2 Samuel chapter 16. Now the story picks up as David's flight from Jerusalem. David is in the midst of fleeing Jerusalem now. His son has taken over the kingdom. He's just lost his throne to his own son, and David walks along the dirty, dusty road, escaping from Jerusalem with his life. And each step of the way, I believe he feels the weight of his grief bearing down on him because of his sin. And this is what has happened because of his sin. And now he's fleeing his own country. And into the scene of personal tragedy comes a wicked and vengeful man who wants to kick David when he's down. I call this scene number 1. I call it, and it's Shimei's offense. Look at chapter 16, verse 5. And when King David came to Bahurim, behold, thence came out a man of the family of the house of Saul, whose name was Shimei, the son of Gera. He came forth and cursed still as he came. And he cast stones at David and at all the servants of King David, and all the people and all the mighty men were on his right hand and on his left. And thus said Shimei when he cursed, come out, thou bloody man, and thou man of Belial. The Lord hath returned upon thee all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord hath delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son. And behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. Notice that Shimei is a relative of Saul. And Shimei now is probably been holding on a grudge because he believes that David took the kingdom away from Saul. And this grudge has been going on for over 20 years now. And ever since David took over the kingdom from Saul, Shimei had this problem and this hatred towards David. And he sees David and he sees the troubles that David is going through, and he sees them as God's judgment on David. And Shimei makes 3 false charges against David here. Look at verse 8 again. Here's what Shimei is yelling down at David. And again, picture the scene. As David is walking down this road and he's got his men, and Shimei is up here on a hill. And he comes running out and he starts cursing at David, and he starts throwing stones at David, and throwing everything he can at David, and yelling at David. And here's what he yells, these 3 false accusations. First off, he says, the Lord hath returned upon all the blood of the house of Saul, in whose stead thou hast reigned. And the Lord has delivered the kingdom into the hand of Absalom thy son, and behold, thou art taken in thy mischief, because thou art a bloody man. All three charges Shimei made are untrue. David did not murder Saul, and he didn't murder anybody in Saul's family. And David did not steal the throne from from Saul. And finally, God did not, as he says, and God gave the kingdom into the hand of Absalom. God did not give the kingdom to Absalom. Absalom took it. All three accusations are wrong, and these are being fired down from a hill above. And as he's throwing and cursing, he's throwing stones and cursing at David, and he's throwing these false accusations. And again, few offenses hurt more than false accusations, especially when they're thrown at us from when we're vulnerable and when we're really hurting. And now Abishai, one of David's right-hand men, he rises and he comes to David's defense and suggests that David allow him to deal with the matter. Look at verse 9. Because forgiveness is the furthest thing from Abishai's mind. Verse 9 says this, and then Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, unto the king, why should this dead dog curse my lord the king? Let me go over, I pray thee, and take off his head. David, this guy shouldn't even be alive. Let me at him. I will take care of him, the king. But David is not looking for revenge. He's looking to God. Remember, David said, I have sinned. He's already confessed it, and God has forgiven him. Throughout all of the lies that Shimei throws out, there's one statement that penetrates David's conscience with a measure of truth, and that's the last statement in verse 8. It says, because thou art a bloody man, which basically can be interpreted, David is a man of bloodshed. You see, David remembers he did kill Uriah. He was responsible for the death of Uriah. And thinking that Shimei's cursing may be a part of God's discipline on his life, this act of murder, David restrains Abishai. Look at verse 10. And the king said, what have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? So let him curse, because the Lord had said unto him, curse David. Who shall then say, wherefore hast thou done so? David said to Abishai and to all his servants, behold my son, which came forth out of my bowels, seeking my life. How much more now may this Benjamite do it? Let him alone, and let him curse, for the Lord hath bidden him. It may be that the Lord will look on mine affliction, and that the Lord will requite me good for his cursing this day. And as David and his men went by the way, Shimei went along on the hillside over against him, and cursed as he went, and threw stones at him, and cast dust. Get the picture. As David is walking down, and man, he is at his lowest point. And here's this man throwing false accusations along with stones and cursing and everything at him. He is kicking David when he is down. But Shimei is angry and bitter, but David overlooks the offense. Because David says, maybe this is the way that God is dealing with my sin. And you ask yourself, how in the world, how could David forgive Shimei at this point? How could he? How is that possible? I mean, this is like real forgiveness. Dale Galloway writes in his book, You Can Win with Love. It's the story of John D. Rockefeller, and he tells this story. He says, the man who built the great Standard Oil empire and demanded high performance from his company's executives, one day, one of the executives made a $2 million mistake. Can you imagine that? He said the news of this man's enormous error soon spread throughout all the executive staff. During the entire day, these men made themselves scarce. They were afraid to even go near Rockefeller's office for fear of his reaction of this mistake. But one brave executive decided he would go ahead and keep his appointment and go in and see Mr. Rockefeller. He tightened his belt and walked in the door as the oil monarch was writing on a piece of paper. Rockefeller looked up and abruptly said, I guess you heard about the $2 million mistake that our friend made. Yes, he said, expecting Rockefeller to explode. Then he said, I have been listing all of the good qualities of our friend here on a sheet of paper. And I've discovered in the past that he's made us many more times than the amount he lost for us today by this one mistake. His good points far outweigh this one human error. I think we should forgive him, don't you? Wouldn't you love to have a boss like that? It doesn't take a $2 million mistake. It could just be a comment that we hear wrong, or we get offended, or a relationship and hurt is damaged. But I will tell you, some people need to do that to their parents. Some people need to do that to their children. Some people need to do that to their mates. Some people need to do that to their in-laws. Some people need to do that to their pastor. Complete, total forgiveness. I want to fast forward in the story. Turn to 2 Samuel chapter 19, because I want to look at Shimei's confession. In the days that follow, the Lord does show David favor and grace, and he stops Absalom's rebellion, and God restores David to the throne. David is now the king of Israel again. And we pick up the story in 2 Samuel chapter 19, verse 16, where the king is triumphantly now returning to Jerusalem. And suddenly Shimei shows up with 1,000 men. 1,000 men from his tribe, and this time he's singing a different tune. Look at 2 Samuel 19, verse 16. And Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite, which was of Bahurim, hasted and came down with the men of Judah to meet King David. And there were 1,000 men of Benjamin with him, and Ziba, the servant of the house of Saul, and his 15 sons, and his 20 servants with him, and they went over Jordan before the king. And they went over a ferry boat to carry over the king's household and to do what he thought good. And Shimei, the son of Gera, fell down before the king as he was come over Jordan. And he said unto the king, Let not my lord impute iniquity unto me, neither do thou remember that which thy servant did perversely the day that my lord the king went out of Jerusalem, that the king should take it to his heart. For thy servant doth know that I have sinned. Therefore, behold, I am come the first of this day of all the house of Joseph to go down to meet my Lord, the king. I find it interesting that Shimei said the exact same 3 words that David did when he cried back in 2 Samuel chapter 12, verse 13, when David cried out, I have sinned. I wonder if that rang a bell in David's heart. But Shimei says, For thy servant does know that I have sinned. Shimei's blasphemies against the Lord's anointed were a capital offense. In fact, that Abishai eagerly pointed out. Look at verse 21. But Abishai, the son of Zeruiah, answered and said, Shall not Shimei be put to death for this? Because he cursed the Lord's anointed. Abishai never changed. He wanted to kill him 2 chapters ago, and he wants to kill him now. You see, Abishai type of people delight in the letter of the law, and they enjoy watching people get what they deserve. I don't ever want to be an Abishai. I really don't. Because those type of people, their advice is give it to him. Give him what he deserves. Let me tell you something, people. If we all got what we deserve, none of us would be here. None of us. For an Abishai type of person, for them to show mercy is a sign of weakness, but David is going to show mercy to Abishai. And after what Shimei said to David earlier, David could have been indifferent to his confession, but listen to what David did in verse 22. And David said, What have I to do with you, ye sons of Zeruiah? Talking about Abishai. That ye should this day be adversaries unto me. Shall there any man be put to death this day in Israel? For do not I know that I am this day king over Israel? Therefore the king said unto Shimei, Thou shalt not die. And the king sware unto him. Wow. David forgives Shimei. And you ask yourself, how could David forgive a snake like Shimei? How is that possible? And I think it's possible because of two things. David's forgiveness is possible because of two things. Number one, David kept his focus on the Lord. Now back to chapter 16. Again, back at chapter 16, verse 12. David says, it may be that the Lord will look on my affliction and that the Lord will requite me good for the cursing this day. David left Shimei's offense in God's more capable hands. And that's good advice for each and every one of us. When we are the offended party, there is great wisdom in taking that offense over to someone who is better able to carry it. As the song chorus goes, all your anxieties, all your cares, bring to the mercy seat, leave them there. Never a burden he cannot bear, never a friend like Jesus. The Bible says, casting all of your cares upon him, for he cares for you. And again, I've said it here before, that word, that casting means to give your burdens over to someone who is better able to carry them. Take them off of my back. I took them off of my back and I gave them to Jesus Christ. So when I got on that plane in Florida, they were gone. Because I gave them to Jesus. Complete forgiveness. And that's what I believe with David. He kept his focus on the Lord. And David, I believe, was aware of his own failures. Because it wasn't that long ago when David was the one who was crying, I have sinned. Because David knew what it meant to be forgiven. And someone who is super proud has a very difficult time with forgiving people. But David was not. He was humble and a person who has just been broken by the Lord, and I have sinned. Again, I put it in your notes there. Forgiven people make the best forgivers. All we have to do is think about what God has forgiven us, and why shouldn't we forgive others? God forgave David for his crimes that were a lot more worse than just throwing some stones and some dust. The question we should ask David is, how could you not forgive him? And we should ask ourselves the same question, because God has forgiven us, how can I not forgive that other person? How can I not? But I want to look at the third part of this story. It's an amazing ending. They'll call it the final scene, and I call it a sobering ending. So turn to 1 Kings chapter 2. Because the story actually concludes years later. And David is now on his deathbed. And in his final instructions to his son Solomon, David's open hand of forgiveness towards Shimei turns into a fist. An interesting conclusion to the story. 1 Kings chapter 2, verse 8 says this. That David is talking to his son Solomon. He says this, and behold, thou hast with thee Shimei, the son of Gera, a Benjamite of Bahurim, which cursed me with a grievous curse in the day when I came to Mahanaim. But he came down to meet me at Jordan. And I swear to him by the Lord, saying, I will not put thee to death with the sword. Now, therefore, hold him not guiltless, for thou art a wise man, and knowest what thou oughtest to do unto him. But his hoar head bring thou down to the grave with blood. Think about that. What an epitaph. How tragic that the man after God's own heart would hold on to this for all those years. This is revenge. It looked like perfect forgiveness, but David still had it held on to it. David says, well, I told him I wouldn't put him to death, but Solomon, you know what you have to do. You're a wise man. Kill him. After all these years, David still held on to it. And he wanted him to pay. And these words were on his lips as he is passing away into eternity. As great a man as David was, a great example, a great king, a man after God's own heart, he's still very much human. And he's just like you and I. And it's just a sad ending to a story of a great man. One of my favorite, again, he's one of my Mount Rushmores in Scripture. But you read this story and it's like, oh, David, you hit it out of the park. You forgave him. And then you get to the rest of the story. Let me give you some practical suggestions for us this evening. Because David's experience reminds us how hard it is really to truly forgive. It's a somber warning to keep a vigilant watch over our own hearts for the spreading seeds of resentment and revenge. I'm going to give you a couple suggestions to help us to stop this at the offense stage before a grudge has a chance to grow. So number one, you must develop a thicker layer of skin. Soft heart and thick skin is good for every one of us. That's the answer, and it's very helpful for a lot of us. You see, you don't walk through thorns with shorts on, right? You're prepared. Soft heart, thick skin. When you deal with people, you have to be well shod. Listen, people are people. And as the old saying goes, ministry would be great if it wasn't for the people. But ministry is people. And it's difficult. People throw darts, and they don't even realize it. And they hurt sometimes. But the thing that we need to remember is we need to ask the Lord for tougher skin so I can deal. Well, there's some people, they just say things, and it's like they don't even realize that they're hurting you. Again, Rick, you didn't really get a chance to study this week, huh? Well, I'll pray for you. It's like, pew, ouch, it hurts. You know? Don't come up to me afterwards and say that. Don't do that now. Pick your own words to say. But if we do that, if we develop a thicker layer of skin, it helps us to keep a sense of balance. So when we are pushed, it doesn't send us reeling over and bouncing and losing our spiritual joy. Secondly, you must try to understand where your offender is coming from. Look beyond the offense to the hurting person lashing out at you. Understand this, people. Hurting people hurt people. Hurting people hurt people. It's true as when I first heard it many, many years ago, but hurting people hurt people. And you have to look at the real issue, and you can turn a hurtful conflict into a healing opportunity, putting ourselves in their shoes and understand, where are you coming from? Because as I was saying, there's a little bit of element of truth in every comment that's made. Just a little hint of truth. Well, maybe I just didn't study as much or something like that. Don't come up to me after and say, don't study. You didn't study. That's why Jesus said on the cross, Father, forgive them, for they don't know what they do. They don't even know what they're doing. In that one statement, we realize how Jesus viewed his enemies. So try to understand where your offender is coming from. Number 3, you must recall the times in your life when you've needed forgiveness. Colossians chapter 3, verse 13 says, forbearing one another and forgiving one another. If any man have a quarrel against you, even as Christ forgave you, so also do ye. Grudges have no place in the Christian's life. Again, forgiven people make the best forgivers. And number 4, you must openly declare forgiveness and then go on from there. The words, I forgive you, are the best therapy for both the offender and the offended. If you have been offended, you free yourself, and the one who has hurt you, you give them forgiveness, and it frees them up also. It is called the gift of grace. But say it to them. Don't just think it. Say it to them. Dad, I forgive you. I will tell you, that was one of the hardest things I've ever said. But one of the most freeing things I've ever said in my life. In conclusion, forgiveness is not a snap of the fingers miracle. It doesn't happen like that. It's a journey, just like he talks about here in the book, that involves a lot of prayer and a commitment of faith and time to heal. But the God of forgiveness will be with you every single step of the way. And I knew it as I made the phone call to my father. Dad, did you mind if I come down for the weekend? From that point on, I could feel God just directing my steps. Until it was the right time to say, Dad, I guess you're wondering why I came down. Until I got on that plane and walked off a free man. Any names come to mind while we were talking through this message? Write them down. And then pray about it. Because if you haven't given complete, total forgiveness, you will never have the freedom that God wants you to have. Let's pray together. Father, again, Lord, I do thank you. I thank you for this message, this lesson which you taught to me first, years ago. I thank you that I learned it once, and I pray that I continue to learn it. Because there's nothing better than a complete, perfect peace when there's no more hurt and revenge and bitterness in a person's heart. So, Lord, I thank you for the lesson of David and Shimei and the lessons that we can learn, but Lord, there's a lesson. I just don't want to go out like David with revenge in my heart. So I pray, Lord, that you help each and every one of us who, if a name popped into our minds, or could be a face or whatever it is, would you help us with that? Because forgiven people should be the best forgivers. I'll thank you for it in Jesus' name. Amen.